Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. What's ahead for polar bears? Presented by Amy Van Dinther and Rinie van Meurs. Amy is our guide development director and has been leading trips for us since 1999. Thanks for being with us today. Amy, I'll hand it over to you.
You bet. Thank you so much, Kendall. And thank you everyone who's signing on to listen to us today. It's just incredible that we still have this wonderful audience of people. So Rinie, I have a special guest with me here today, and I want to introduce him. I do see that the screen, are we connected to my screen yet, Kendall?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry guys for the interruption. I'm getting a little message over here. Rinie, thank you so much for joining us. I met you in 2011, and I've got a little story about that, but first I'd like you to introduce yourself to the audience.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is Rinie van Meurs. I am Dutch. I'm from the Netherlands, and my connection with polar bears started in 1989. I was always a naturalist in my life, of course, but in 1989, I found a job on a small ship as a potato peeler, and with that ship, I went to Spitsbergen or Svalbard, north of Norway, near the pack ice, and that was my goal. I wanted to see the pack ice. I wanted to see the animals and the birds and to photograph. Polar bears was not my first love yet, and so that first season in 1989, I fell in love with the Arctic, and I've been back there ever since. For 31 consecutive years. This summer is the first summer after 31 years that I actually experienced the European summer, actually. And so far, I enjoy it. My background is forest management and nature conservation, so there is, of course, a link with my study. But over time in Spitsbergen, I started to, this was a small passenger ship that I worked on as a crew. Second year, I went back. And so gradually I became a leader. The industry started to grow, the ships got bigger, and I became within no time, expedition leader in charge of the program and the landings, etc. And over time, I became interested in the polar bear. And the polar bear made me also interested in the whole Arctic sea ice ecosystem. And then one day I realized, hey, the sea ice is not just a hunting platform for a polar bear. There's a lot of things more happening. And this is the result here next to me.
All right, I'm so excited to talk about your book. You know, I remember that concept of the sea ice not just being like a cocktail with ice cubes in it, right? It's not just that plain water. In 2011, I came back to polar bear season after having my kids, and you were so helpful. You sat down with me and we went over a presentation on the Arctic sea ice and on the ecosystem. I'll never forget that. It was really great of you to help out with that. So thank you. I want to ask you first, the book is called The Future of Polar Bears. Is that correct?
It's called The Future Polar Bear.
The Future Polar Bear.
The impact of the vanishing, the subtitle is at least as important, the impact of the vanishing sea ice on an Arctic ecosystem.
Okay. And can you tell us, before we get talking about that ecosystem, it's a beautiful book. Why write this book?
Why? Over the years, of course, I became so passionate about polar bears and the whole Arctic sea ice ecosystem. And at some point, I did a book on polar bears in 2006. This little one, Polar Bears of Spitsbergen or Svalbard. Can you see it?
Yeah.
It was in 2006. And shortly afterwards, I realized climate change became, of course, very well known among the passengers, and so we talked about it. And at some point I thought, let's do a book about polar bears and climate change. And the first work title I had in my mind was On Melting Sea Ice, the Future of the Polar Bear. And I asked a good friend of mine from California, Robert Christopherson, who did the foreword for this book now. And I met him and his wife many years ago in Greenland on one of the expedition cruises, and I asked him if he could help me with some editing and stuff. He said, yeah. So eventually we got involved in the book, and then we decided, wait, climate change and polar bears is a very narrow, it's a very limited subject. There's very few people might be interested in that. People should also know it's a whole ecosystem. So Robert and I, we sat together. He came to visit me here. We sat together and we worked out a table of contents, and we were going to do the book together. However, he became so busy, swamped with work, with his books, Geosystems, and that he had to resign. And we're still good friends. I mean, he didn't have the time anymore. We started off already with a few chapters. So I put everything in the cupboard and I let it rest there for some years, and I didn't think about it anymore until I met a good friend of mine from the university in Antwerp, Louis Bijens. And Louis did already a few books on Arctic, and Louis is an expert in microscopic organisms in microbiology in the Arctic, in the polar regions. So I asked him, what about if we can we do this book together? You do all the plankton and all the sea ice and the microbes and the bacteria, and I will do the birds and the animals and the polar bears. And he said, yeah, straight away. And we found a publisher in Belgium, and here we are.
That's
more
fantastic.
than 10 years later. More than 10 years later, finally. So never give up.
I think sometimes people think that a book happens really quickly, like, oh, I did this year, I wrote this book. But it seems to me that most of the writers I know, and I think you're saying this, it's a lifetime in the making. It's all of the experience that you have, and then the whole process of writing the book. So we see a picture here of all your papers on the floor of your office. What was the process of actually getting to that nitty-gritty and building this book for people?
Okay, so, well, first of all, I have to say that I was also a little surprised that in the media on TV, when they were talking about the declining of sea ice, they always showed the polar bears. And I thought the public is going to get a false impression that we only lose the polar bear if we lose the Arctic sea ice in another 50 years or so. And but that's not true. We lose a whole ecosystem. So anyway, so at some point we decided to do this book on the Arctic ecosystem, and then I forgot your question. What was the question?
What was the writing process like for you? Like building that table of contents and actually getting to the nitty-gritty.
Yeah. So most important thing is when you start a book like this is you write a table of contents. You want to know where you want to start, how to build it up from the very basis of the food web, from the inorganic environment, from the sea floor all the way up to the polar bear, through the whole food web. And then you have the chapters, and then you work out what can I put in these chapters, and then you play around. Maybe this topic can go to the next chapter or one chapter back, or there's always a little bit of overlap to make it a flow, to guide the people, to lead the people from the beginning of the forming of sea ice and what's happening with that ice, inside the ice, and who lives there under the ice, on top of the ice, and guide the people through the top to the apex predator polar bear.
Hi, Annie. Sorry to interrupt. We are not seeing your screen. We're only seeing the webcams. It looks like we're still waiting to view your screen.
Okay, so that's what I thought was maybe happening. I was getting that message.
There we go.
Okay.
I see it now. Thank you.
All right. Sorry for that, guys. I'll tell you here, as you see these slides, we're doing things a little bit differently today. What we're doing is just letting the pictures loop through. There's the ecosystem, polar bears, the seal. So we're just going to have those pictures showing as Rinie and I continue this interview. So Rinie, you shared with us that you've been working in the Arctic for many years. You've worked for Natural Habitat, Hudson Bay, guiding polar bear trips. When you came to the point where you needed to put this information together, and you had to decide what makes it into the book and what doesn't go into the book. What makes something scientific in your mind?
That takes most time to put this together. You collect scientific papers, books, you name it. I had really good, very prominent people helping me. Wayne Lynch, Ian Sterling, Andy Roger, Robert Christopherson, they're all helping me with providing information, scientific papers. I already had a bind. You go on the website, then you start reading them. Also, it is important that you check on the time, on the year that paper was published, because you want to have an updated book, right? Because information is the data is changing every year. It's updating every year. So and then you have all these papers, and then you're gonna sort them out, and you say, okay, this is for the chapter reproduction, this is for the chapter dynamics and population and distribution, this is for the chapter hunting and food, etc. And you put all these piles together, and you start reading, and you start highlighting the topics, the information that you want to put in your book. And then when you start writing that chapter, you try to, like a novel, you try to bring it as a story. You begin somewhere with the beginning. For instance, the chapter reproduction, you begin with the mating season. Makes sense, right? And then you follow that female through her life cycle, through 2.5 years, as she mates, gives birth, and raises her cubs, and weans her cubs, and mates again. So we follow her through her in her private life for 2.5 years, so to say. Yeah, it makes sense. And as I was writing along, in the text interwoven is the impacts of the climate change. So at the end of every chapter, or at the end of the book, there is not a little chapter saying what will happen if the sea ice disappears. No, it is directly in the text. Even if you are a climate denier, if you don't believe in climate change, if you would read and skip the impacts of climate change, you will learn a lot about polar bear biology and also about plankton, etc.
Okay, so one of the things I think is
there we go. Here's the picture. It's a lot of.
There you go. One of the questions I have for you is, you know, as guides, sometimes we actually get more time in the field with the animals than even some of the top researchers who are studying these animals. So can you speak to that a little bit?
One of the world's most prominent polar bear researchers, Ian Sterling from Canada. We worked together on the expedition cruise ships in the past a bit, and he always introduced me as Rinie is a polar bear scientist from a different perspective. And another writer put in his book, he mentioned my name. He said, and this Dutch guy has probably seen more polar bears in the wild than any scientist, because scientists, of course, they have limited budget. They have to go and capture bears, take measurements, take samples, and make quick observations. But I spent weeks and weeks. I've done more than 200 cruises only around Spitsbergen. I would say 250 cruises in the Arctic. And for the last 10 years, I spent most of the time in the sea ice observing and watching polar bears, because people want to photograph them. I do now mostly polar bear trips, not only in the sea ice, also in Churchill, 14 years now for natural habitat. And so I have much more time to watch those bears forever in their natural behavior. If we have a bear on a seal kill a little distance, we stop the ship and we sit there for hours. Not many scientists have the chance to do that. It's very expensive to rent a ship and to sit there and wait until something is happening. Photographers are very patient for that. They can sit there for hours, and while they take the pictures, I observe, I make notes. So
nice. Yeah, and certainly we were on the rover.
Probably much more field experience than a lot of scientists. I believe that. Yeah.
That makes so much sense, and I can speak to that just from experience you and I both have of being on those rovers. You get some pretty solid bear days when you're doing that in Churchill, of course. Now you've talked quite a bit about the sea ice and building up the book related all to the sea ice. It's not just ice cubes in a cup of water or something else. So what is the sea ice? When you talk about that, what is it?
Good question. Sea ice is not just frozen water. When seawater freezes, the minerals, the sea salt, concentrates in small pockets, in small chambers in the ice. This is physics. Don't ask me how it works. Physics. It concentrates in small pockets inside the ice. It's called the brine. This has a very high salt concentration, and by Earth's gravity and the salt it eats, it melts through the because of its weight. It melts down through the ice and it expels below the sea ice into the seawater, leaving behind small channels. Sometimes the channels are very close to each other and they break through and they get all interconnected. In other words, 1 square meter, I would say, 1 square meter of sea ice, 1 square yard of sea ice, more than triples in surface area underneath. Yeah, because all those channels, these are all surface areas. Now, sympagic algae, sea ice algae, they colonize all those little brine channels. Microscopic organisms, they all start to colonize those new areas, and where they can graze on that sea ice algae, and they can go in the small channels. And slightly bigger microscopic organisms, zooplankton, they come and feed on the algae, but also hunt for the smaller zooplankton organisms. So there's a lot of life in that ice. It's packed. Sea ice is packed, absolutely packed with sea ice algae, mostly diatoms, microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, zooplankton, you name it. It's packed with life. It's the base for the whole food web. More than 30% of the primary production in the Arctic comes from underneath the sea ice.
Wow. So in a way, it's almost like the estuary of the Arctic. It's where a lot of things begin. So what I think you're saying here is, of course, it's an ecosystem, right? And not just an ecosystem for the polar bear. Yet the food web in the Arctic is pretty different than it is in other places. Can you tell us a little bit about the Arctic food web?
Now, so now we have this frozen seawater, we have sea ice colonized by life, a lot of live algae. It fuels the whole food web because all those microscopic organisms, the zooplankton, mostly very important zooplankton organism in the Arctic is the copepod. Copepod, a Colanus species. There are 3 species: Hyperboreus, Glacialis, and Finmarchicus. And they graze in and near the ice on these algae. Small fish, like the polycod. Polycod is a fish about 6 inches long, 6-7 inches max. And there's one in the beak of that kittiwake on the picture now. They live underneath the ice and they feed on those small crustaceans. These copepods, the English name is or-feeded, that's called copepod. This means or-feeded. Anyway, they live under the ice. They graze the fish, the polycod. They come and feed on these small crustaceans. This polycod is around the whole Arctic sea ice ecosystem, the Keystone Species. If people are not familiar with the Keystone Species, everybody knows what the keystone is, I guess. There's this stone in an arch. When you build the arch with stones, there's always in the middle, the top, this one stone. And if you take that out, the whole arch collapses. Now, the polycod is the Keystone Species in the Arctic. Only in, for instance, just to give you an example how common these fish are, only in the Barents Sea north of Norway. It's a relatively small ocean, but it's very rich because it's above the continental shelf. It's estimated to be 2 million tons of polycod. Now, anyway, so then we have the ring seal, and the ring seal is the main prey of the polar bear. Yeah, there's millions of ring seals around the Arctic, and they feed primarily on polycod underneath that ice. Many other birds and other animals feed on that cod as well, of course, but if we want to go to the apex predator polar bear, then we stop with the ring seal and to some extent harp seals and beta seals. They feed on that polar cod. Now, and then on the top, of course, the polar bear uses that ice as a hunting platform to hunt for those seals. Otherwise, he has no access to seals if he hasn't got the ice to hunt on. The seals also need the ice for giving birth, for mating, for molting. So they need the ice physically as well, not only the fish for food, but also physically to get out of the water and do their business as well. So they need that ice too. And that ice needs to be preferable above the shallow waters of the continental shelf. The Arctic basin, right, around the North Pole is like 18 to 20,000 feet deep. It's a marine desert. It's very marine unproductive. wherever the ice further south towards Asia, towards Canada, wherever it overlays the shallow waters of the continental shelf, only max 1,000 feet. Yeah, that's where we have an upwelling. That's where all the nutrients from deeper waters well up, and they enter the photozone near the ice, and they fuel the whole the fertilizers for the algae, for the phytoplankton, but also for the sea ice algae. And so the best habitat for Arctic sea ice wildlife is sea ice overlaying the continental shallow waters of the continental of the shelves.
So the center of the Arctic Ocean is quite deep. That you're saying is not the productive place, correct?
No. Yeah.
Okay.
So in the future, often you hear people say, well, Rinie, but would there always be some ice at the North Pole? Yeah, maybe if we're lucky. But bears have nothing to eat there because it is too deep. Nutrients, they sink to deeper waters. They need to come to the surface to fuel the algae near the surface waters where there is sunlight for the photosynthesis. As simple as that.
Sounds like it's gardening, but in the Arctic.
Yeah,
basically.
well, it is. It is.
You've got all the makings, right? So we're talking about this ecosystem, and we've got this productive place where all of this is happening. And Hudson Bay is similar to this. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the basics of the polar bear and how did they become a polar bear? Talk to us a little bit about the evolution of the polar bear in that habitat.
Okay, polar bears and brown bears are nowadays still very, very close related. And until the 90s, it was thought that polar bears were about 200, 150,000 years old. And until in how did they become a polar bear? That theory still stands. Probably somewhere in the Arctic, nobody knows exactly when and where still. Somewhere near the Arctic Ocean, a population of brown bears started to venture out on the sea ice hunting for seals. Bears are smart animals, have good memories, they are inventive, they are adaptive. So some brown bears discovered that food source, seals out on the ice, and they're also very opportunistic. So they started to use that source when land ice was formed during a glacier, during a glacial period. Those bears got cut off from other brown bears, so they adapted even more into polar bears. Now, the land ice is gone, and the bears now make a full living out on the sea ice. That's still a theory that most scientists also believe that's how it happens. But when and where, nobody knows exactly. In the 1990s, when DNA analysis became very advanced, they discovered, the bear research did a lot of DNA research, and they discovered that the ABC bears, ABC Islands of Alaska, Admiralty, Baranov, and Chichakov, those bears were very, very close related to polar bears, the DNA, closer than to their cousins on the mainland. And we got it. That must have been just after the Salian or the Eolian glacial period, when the bears left the ABC Islands and became a polar bear. So they thought that the ABC bears gave rise to the polar bear, and some 150,000 years ago. So problem solved. Until 2004, fast forward. In 2004, they found a fossil in Spitsbergen, Svalbard, north of Norway, and the analysis showed that that bear was between 130 and 110,000 years old, and it was a lower jaw of a modern polar bear, and analysis of the stable isotope showed that this bear was living off the marine environment. Wait a minute, this was right in the Eemian or in the Sangamon warm period, our last interglacial warm period. Wait a minute, so if the bears left ABC Islands 150,000 years ago, they started to venture out on the ice during that cold period of the Salian. So within 20,000 years, that brown bear evolved from a brown bear to a polar bear completely and dispersed all over the Arctic. That's very, very fast. And evolution can go fast, but that quick is very unlikely. Until in 2011, we're getting closer now, 2011, they did analysis on fossils of a Irish extinct brown bear. And the fossils were around between 40 and 10,000 years old. And they found an even closer match to a polar bear. That turned the whole ABC theory upside down. Wait a minute, so 150,000 years ago, and the ABC bears gave rise to the polar bear, and 100,000 years later, the Irish bears did it again? That's very unlikely. And there were already polar bears. More advanced studies of DNA showed, I'll cut it short, showed that actually the gene flow was from the polar bears into the brown bears. What happened in both periods, 130,000 years ago, sorry, 150,000 years ago, and 40,000 years ago, roughly, the ice was that far south that bears probably had met brown bears in Ireland or in the ABC Islands, what they still do today. And polar bears became stranded, the ice receded, some polar bears left behind, started to interbreed with the brown bears, and the brown bears eventually turned those polar bears over time in completely brown bears again, but still carrying a lot of DNA of the original polar bear. So today, they think that the modern polar bear is at least 500,000 years old. When exactly it left the land and became a polar bear, it's still a mystery.
Us Alaskans do like to claim it, that's for sure. We'd like that it happened here. So that's pretty complicated stuff that you're talking about there. But what I think you're saying, and what I know to be true that you're saying, is that the polar bears and the brown bears have been mixing for some time, kind of going back and forth as things warm. Is that the way that they survived the past warming periods? Or did they have other techniques and adaptations to survive the warmer times that we know about in our geological record?
Yeah, we'll have to get that question among the passengers asking. But really, they have survived warm periods before. Yes, but first of all, not every warm period is the same. For instance, the Amian, the Sangamon, warm period was just after a much colder ice age as we had later, as we had now just behind us. So the impact on the oceans and the whole geography was different. Nobody knows exactly where the ice was, if there was still ice, and where. Probably during that Amian could be still somewhere enough ice for some small bears to survive, or maybe bears had different ways to survive. One theory, and Ian Sterling did recently a paper on that, it's only a year and a half old, that paper, that polar bears during the warm period most likely were facilitated by scavenging on dead whales. He calculated that one big dead whale, like in the Arctic, the bowhead whales or the gray whales, the consumable part of a bowhead whale equals 1,300 consumable parts of a ring seal. Equals 1,300 ring seals, or consumable parts of 1,300 ring seals. So one bear can survive 28 years feeding on one big whale. So, and they calculated, because in Northwest Alaska and on the Chukotka coast, they keep track of the dead whales that wash up on the beaches, and because of natural mortality, natural cause of death, they calculated that from the normal mortality rate, about 47 large whales wash upon the shores every year on the Chukotka and Alaska coast. That's 47 whales. That's a lot. One big, 7 big whales can feed an entire subpopulation of polar bears for 4 months open water season. So bears are great scavengers, and a few years ago on Wrangel Island, northeast Russia, 180 bears were feeding on a bowhead whale. and we had dead whales in Spitsbergen where bears were 7, 8, 9 bears were feeding on it for 2 years. So most likely bears were facilitated by scavenging on dead whales. And remember, this was pre-whaling season. Yeah, can you imagine the number of whales 100,000 years ago? The number of whales that would die every year and washing up on the rocks and the beaches, and bears were scavenging on. And maybe there was some ice in the winter that they still could hunt a seal or two, but the whales probably most have was a great support for the bears to survive that warm period.
That makes so much sense that there would have been more of them. I remember reading accounts about Cape Cod Bay, and that the whalers said they could walk across the backs of whales to get across the bay. So pre-whaling numbers of whales is just something I would love to see personally. I've said for a long time the best way to clean up the ocean is to make sure we have more whales. Sounds like it's also a great way to feed polar bears. Now, switching gears a little bit here, the polar bears now, we know that there's 19 different subpopulations, and the estimates are about 20,000 perhaps bears that are in the world. We're seeing places like here in Alaska where the bears are coming ashore and they're having to find other food sources. We heard about what a great food source a dead whale is, but what are they going to come across now? And is that going to be enough to support them?
Well, that's the question, of course. That's the big question. Also, for instance, the warming period that we most likely gonna get now, scientists predict that it will be probably much warmer than the Eemian, or definitely different, because, for instance, during the Eemian, that last warm period, there was 280 parts per million carbon dioxide in the air, and we have already 416. So that Eemian is not an analog for what we're going to get now and what is predicted for the future. That first of all. But yeah, the question then is, of course, sort of they predict that in end of the century there will be no sea ice left at all in the summer, or at least for long summers. And nobody knows. And this often said, like, well, bears, they can move on land and they start looking for eggs and berries, but hello, bird eggs are only available for a couple of weeks a year, and polar bears, they need about 45-50 seals a year, and a kilo of seal fat is 8,000 calories. You can't replace that just within 40 years in adaptation within 40 years and start living off the land. That's impossible. I have some.
That's not going to work, basically, is what you're saying. They're not going to be able to sort of revert to brown bears. And
their whole digestive system is not anymore equipped for digesting plant material. It's 100% carnivorous animal, and he's not going to change that within 40 years so that he can start eating grass like the brown bears.
Okay. Now you have a chapter in your book, a section about the reproduction with polar bears, and you start that out by saying that the female polar bear is essential to the success in the future. Can you explain that a little bit?
Oh, so the question is, what are the potential problems? Well, of course, if females cannot reproduce, of course, then the population is doomed. As simple as that. Let's give you an example. Hudson Bay, stay close to home for you. Hudson Bay. The average weight, I have some conversions here somewhere, make sure I'll say the right thing. The average weight of a female used to be in the 1970s, 80s, 650 pounds. Yeah, that was the average weight of a lone female weight in November. Yeah, because in the summer they're much heavier, in November they're much lighter. So you always compare, of course, when you collect scientific data, you compare all these weights and everything in the same time of the year. So lone female in November, 650 pounds, most likely pregnant, because a polar bear, an adult female polar bear, is always with cubs, and if she's not with cubs, she's pregnant. And so in November, lone female, 650 pounds, pregnant. That weight has dropped to 230 kilos, which is 507 pounds in 2010. So there's a weight loss of 143 pounds for the lone female captured in November. This is the average weight, of course. Those females, which were 189 kilos or 416 pounds, those females, 416 pounds or less, none of those females were ever seen in the following spring or observed with cubs. So the threshold is for the pregnant females in the Hudson Bay, because the Hudson Bay, they are unique. I'll get to that in a minute. The threshold is about 460 pounds or lower, where females no longer can complete the denning cycle, or they abort the denning, they abort the cubs, they leave the cubs premature and for the winter in order to start hunting and so they can survive themselves. So the threshold is where females no longer can reproduce is around 400 pounds or less. And this is, of course, for the females in Hudson Bay, because the pregnant females in Hudson Bay, they have to fast 4 months solid. It's the only animal, only mammal in the planet, which is fasting for 4 months solid and during active pregnancy and nursing and raising the cubs.
Wow. So the female
4 months fasting followed by 3 months denning period is 7 months. 7 months total fasting, and during which they give birth and nurse and raise the cubs until spring.
So the Hudson Bay females they've got to go a long time. The Hudson Bay females have to go a long time without food, and
yes,
they have to gain enough weight during the feeding time so they can sustain those pregnancies. Is that correct? That's what you're saying, right?
Yes, because so if the sea ice keeps deteriorating as they predict, then probably those females at the southernmost range of the Arctic sea ice area, like the Hudson Bay, are most likely the first females that actually stop reproducing. Other areas where bears live further north, closer to the sea ice, they still have access to seals until they go into the den. Not the Hudson Bay females. Well, not only the females, all the bears of the Hudson Bay, of course, but the females, they have 7 months fasting. All the other bears of Hudson Bay, they have only 4 months, and then they come back hunting in November. Females, they can't, because in November they go in the den and they continue fasting. So
are the Hudson Bay Bears a bit of a canary in the mine, if you will? Are they showing us the sort of future of bears that are farther north?
They balancing on the edge of the sharp knife, as we say in Holland, and and they unfortunately, I'm afraid, they're getting closer to that line where they no longer, of course, where more and more females fail to reproduce, and then eventually, of course, the population disappears. But also in some other areas, like near Wrangel Island, where bears are marooned for a long time, especially now in recent years, where the sea ice in the Chukchi Sea recedes and in the Beaufort Sea recedes far and fast away from the land. Bears have little choice. Ride the sea ice above the Arctic Basin, where there is not much to eat, or go on land and there's not much to eat either. And that's what we see in the Baltic Sea.
And this is all related to the vanishing sea ice, right? If the Hudson Bay Bear doesn't have that ice to get out on and feed enough, then it's not going to be heavy enough. In the north, same thing. They need that ice. Is that the only challenge that they face? Is that the only challenge that the polar bear faces, the vanishing sea ice, or are there other hardships, if you will, for them?
But I want to say something more about the Hudson Bay Bears. The Hudson Bay breaks up, well, most the ice-free season all around the Arctic is already 3 weeks longer. It increases by 5 days per decade. Overall, it's 3 weeks longer. Ice-free means 15% ice cover or less. Yeah, it's called ice-free. So the ice-free season has increased by 3 weeks, also in the Hudson Bay, at least 3 weeks. The problem in the Hudson Bay, though, is that the ice breaks up 3 weeks earlier. Not so much freezing up later, it's breaking up earlier, which cuts the bears on both ends. And their fasting season is prolonged, but what worse is, they are cut short on 3 weeks hunting time, because the summer, when the ice is still there, they can hunt. So they have to stop hunting 3 weeks earlier than normal. And that could mean they would come ashore with about 80, 90 pounds less body fat than they would normally do. Roughly.
So that's adding to the fasting time that was already challenging for them.
Yes, and what we see in the Beaufort Sea is now bears looking for ice. And the Beaufort Sea north of Alaska, the open water season are 50 days, much longer than in the past. And there's much more annual ice now as well. We have 95% of the Arctic is annual ice that melts and freezes up every year again. No, not what was it? Oh, sorry, I made a mistake here with the number. Forget about that. In the Beaufort Sea, the ice has become very volatile. And because the strong currents and winds push the ice all over the place, it breaks up earlier. So bears normally would feed above the shelf on the north coast of Alaska. That shelf extends about 70, 80 miles north into the Arctic Ocean, and then it drops down to the Arctic Basin. Now, bears prefer to feed above that shelf, but the ice now breaks up earlier and moves much farther north than in the past, and also faster. So bears have little choice. Do I go on land earlier this year, or do I stay with the ice and ride the ice above the unproductive Arctic Basin? So bears, they are all over the place looking for that ice. To give you an example, and that increases also mortality among the cubs, because the mother needs the ice after she leaves the den with her cubs. She needs to eat because she's been losing a lot of weight. Between 2004 and 2010, they collected the data from 68 female polar bears, because only females are deployed with collars, with satellite transmitters. They collected the data from 68 females, of which they took the 50 longest swimming events. And a long swimming event is 35 miles, nautical miles, or more. Of those 50 longest swimming events, 20 different females were involved, which means some females had more than one long swimming event. 11 females of these 20 had cubs of the year when they were deployed with that satellite transmitter. 5 of those mothers lost their cubs during those long swimming events, which is a mortality of 45%. That's simple, right? They compare that with the mothers with little cubs that remained year-round on the ice, that managed to stay on the ice. Their mortality among those little cubs was only 18%. So when mothers with little cubs are involved with these long swimming trips, swimming events, the mortality more than doubles for the young cubs. And that makes sense, because scientists see every spring still a lot of females with little cubs, but they see very few yearlings, relatively. So a lot of cubs must die in that first year.
Wow, that sounds like...
Yeah, Southern Hudson Bay, same problem. They see still females, lots of females with newborn cubs, but they count relatively very few yearlings. So a lot of cubs die in the first year. Mortality is always the highest in the first year, but it seems to increase dramatically in some areas.
And the polar bears are not the only animal that's affected, correct?
No, I just mentioned the Chukchi Sea. The Chukchi Sea has a large walrus population, And walruses, the males and the females, the females, the mothers and the calves, and the females and the males, they live in separate herds, yeah, separate groups most of the year. When the ice breaks up, the females remain with the sea ice because that's safer for them. They can jump in the water when the bear tries to attack their calves. Males, they can go on land and haul out because they are bigger and stronger, and they to defend themselves against polar bears. The mothers try to stay with the calves out on the ice and use the ice as a raft to feed above the shallow waters of the Chukchi Sea. Yeah, and then they come back on the ice to rest, to nurse. Now, the Chukchi Sea, the continental shelf extends much further north, several hundred miles further north than north of Alaska. So what they did is, over time, they were using that sea ice as a raft, and they were traveling with the ice over that shallow water. They could feed, they come back on the ice, they could go out down and feed in waters not deeper than 50 meters, and then come back on the ice and stay there. The males would feed closer to land, and they would haul out on land. All fine, until 10-15 years ago, they discovered that the ice is moving fast, far beyond the continental shelf. So what are you going to do as a mother with little calves? You can't feed above the Arctic Basin, it's too deep, 20,000 feet deep. You can't feed there with your calf. So what you do is the only choice is to haul out with your calf is coming ashore, go to land where the males are. So some of those haul out sites are overcrowded. Where there used to be 20,000 walruses haul out, there's now 100 or more thousand walruses hauling out. And of course, especially the females with the calves, they're very skittish. They're very what's the word?
Frightened?
Yeah, frightened, because they afraid that something's going to happen to the calf. So they're very skittish, they're very alert. So they get easily spooked by a helicopter, by a bear, people, a boat. So when they spook half those herds of tens of thousands of wolves, they all spook in the water without knowing what's going on, and they get spooked and go in the water, and especially the young animals get crushed under these stampedes. Some of the stampedes are left with hundreds of dead walruses, and yeah, so that's a big problem. So now also the females have to feed near land like the males do. So you wonder for how much longer can that area closer to land feed double the amount of walrus, so to say, because the ice is too far beyond the continental shelf. There's all that food above the continental shelf, but it's out of reach of the female walruses with their calves. They can't get there because they have to swim, what, 300 miles and then come back 300 miles? That doesn't make sense. And because normally they would, as I said, they would use that ice as a raft above that shelf. So that's a serious problem there. A lot of walrus get killed in stampedes, and you wonder how long that. Here's the picture. All these one of those Cape Sets and Cayman, one of those haul outs. Yeah.
So we've got the.
But now we've been talking about big animals, but in a nutshell, here in the North Atlantic, on the west coast of Norway, there is a small copepod, that little crustacean that I mentioned before, Finnmarkukus. Further north, close to the ice, where the Arctic wildlife mostly depend on through the food web, is the Calanus Finnmarkukus, glacialis. Now, as water temperature increases in the Barents Sea and on the west coast of Spitsbergen, that Finnmarkukus that lives further south in slightly warmer water starts to migrate north, entering the area of the much fatter glacialis, which in the meantime has shifted north as well, because they remain with colder water. So the environment is now replaced by the less fatty Calanus Finnmarkukus copepod. Now, in the Arctic, there is a little planktiforous bird, the little auk or dovkie, and they feed on those small crustaceans. So now their feeding areas, they, instead of catching glacialis, which has much more fat, they now have to catch the Finnmarkukus, and because the glacialis is too far away, so they go feed on the Finnmarkukus. But so they need to feed much more often and make many more flights in order to bring the same amount of energy to their chicks to raise them. So they yeah.
Okay, so let's get back to the polar bear, I had asked that question before. Other than the vanishing sea ice, are there other issues that the polar bears face?
Oh, yes. Well, the bear is a threatened species, and I wonder why we still allow hunting. There's hunting and poaching, and there's every year still on average about 1,000 bears get killed. And despite a legal quota, however, most subpopulation data is very deficient. So you can ask yourself, should we still hunt bears? And there's another one, and these are pollution. Bears in the Arctic, especially the ones in the North Atlantic and in the Barents Sea, have high levels of lipophilic organic pollutants like PCBs, PBDEs, DDT, and recently is the PFOs has entered their food web through the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream brings it all up north into the and the air circulation into the food web in the Arctic. The polar bears of around the Barents Sea are the most polluted polar bears of the Arctic and one of the most polluted, contaminated mammals in the world. Ooh,
So,
and the problem with these PCBs and all these polychlorinated biphenyls and other lipophilic contamination is that they get stored in their body fat, and they're very persistent. It takes many years before they actually are before they dissolve. The problem is they're lipophilic, so mothers and cubs, when the cubs are born, the mother feeds the cubs with milk that contains between 30 and 40% fat, so she downloads all her lipophilic contaminants onto the cubs. Cubs of 1 year old have sometimes higher levels than their own mother. So it's very heartbreaking when you watch a bear with little cub, like here in the picture now, when you watch a bear with little cubs, and it's a happy family, but only we know that she's actually poisoning her cubs.
that's so very difficult. So we've learned from you here that the ice is an ecosystem for the bears. It affects all kinds of species, and there's other challenges as well. With all of that, what hope do we have? What can we, hang on to or effort towards? What work needs to be done so that my grandbabies can hopefully get to enjoy polar bears the way I have?
Yeah, well, thank God that the knowledge on climate change, the fact that we realize that climate change is actually happening, has accelerated the last 10-15 years. And I also would like to say that the polar region travel, the Arctic traveling, the polar regions has that industry, that travel, ecotourism has increased drastically, creating ambassadors and attention among the public, like what we do in the Arctic, in the Hudson Bay for natural habitat. We create ambassadors, show the people there, they go back home and they talk about the bears. So we create awareness, more awareness among the people. And thank God for the last 10-15 years, the whole world, everything is accelerating to try to do something about it. Like we try to do now about plastic. It just, the war on plastic started recently. Thank God, that's another problem. And but so let's hope that soon we can. I personally don't believe that we can stop it just like that, but we can slow it down, probably maybe buying time for the bears to maybe adapt, maybe survive that warm period in small pockets, living off a few dead whales like they did during the Eemian or the Sangamon warm period. And that's the hope. That's the hope. About these chemicals, some of the chemicals start to disappear and start to drop. So there is also light in the tunnel, at the end of the tunnel with that. But yeah, with the changing sea ice, let's hope we buy time that there will be some ice somewhere left for a small population of polar bears to survive.
Yes, let's hope that that happens. I bet that there are people who are interested in this book that you've written. It's been so fascinating to learn from you. I always do whenever we talk with each other. And I just want to let people know how they would be able to get a copy of this book. I just did the process myself. Oh, looks like we've got a visitor. The Natural History Book Surface is the website that you can go to in order to order this spectacularly beautiful book. The photos that you're seeing here today are in the book. And again, it's the Natural History Book Surface. It's very easy, just similar to other large book ordering companies. You can just click on and have this book shipped to you. So with that, Kendall, I want to thank you, Rinie, for joining us today. It's been wonderful to learn from you and to hear about this masterpiece that you've created. And I think Kendall will open it up to questions now.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. And I do want to remind folks, if they do have questions for us, you can fill that out in the question field in the control panel. So there's a lot of folks who are interested in the other wildlife in the slideshow, and they want to know the names. So if you'd be able to go through a few of these that aren't polar bears or walruses, they're easily identifiable.
Sure. Rinie, do you want to tell us about this one here?
This is the dovekie. The dovekie, a small cousin of the puffin. Everybody is familiar with puffins.
That's the bird you were talking about. What about this guy?
Bearded seal, also on the menu of the polar bear, but not in the top. Ring seals are the prime prey of polar bear.
What about this species?
This is the Homo sapien.
Okay, and I think we've also got some photos in there of some plankton, some of the copepods.
Yeah, I'm waiting. The one with the two antennae, that's the copepod. A small crustacean. Awesome. This is the ring seal because the spots on its back, they're little rings. And this is Andy Roger researching a polar bear, checking on his teeth. Here we found a dead narwhal and 25 bears were. This is the ice algae, diatoms.
And this bird?
Polar cod. When we push the ice floe away with the ship, the fish becomes exposed and the kittiwakes, they can grab them. The kittiwake cannot swim underneath the ice. The bird was a kittiwake, cannot swim underneath the ice and grab that and then come back up like a penguin or like a guillemot or a thick-billed Meurs, you call them. So they wait until we push the ice and then a polar cod becomes exposed and then they plunge dive to grab them out of the water. This is a planktophorius also. This is the crested auklet in Alaska, the Pribilov. This Cape Sesser came in one of those overcrowded walrus hole outsides. Here's a few bears. Look how fat they are. They've been feeding for 2 years on this dead fin whale. Brown bear.
Okay, I think that covers what we saw here as far as other species. There is one other bird, I believe. We'll see if
that beautiful color bird is the king eider.
There we go. Okay, so are there other questions, Kendall?
Oh yes, there are. A lot of people are really curious about the intermixing of polar bears and brown bears, and they're wondering if with the warmer temperatures there'll be more of that due to migration.
Most likely, yeah, we already see it happening, and as we learned, it happened already 150,000 years ago, or even longer, and it will happen, but yeah, what effect that's going to be on the species is not known if we get more hybrids. So would that help the bear to adapt? Not known. We only have 2 wild hybrids, 2006 and 2010, the 2 only wild natural hybrids of bears, brown bears, polar bears. So, but what that's going to happen with those hybrids? They probably breed more and more with the brown bears, and they become brown bears again, like the polar bears became brown bears on the ABC Islands. But it's not like, oh, if they crossbreed with the brown bear, then they can easier survive. No, it's not that simple.
Okay. And earlier you mentioned that ring seals are also dependent on sea ice. So what happens to them, and how or where do they survive in the absence of sea ice?
Well, exactly. That's the whole food web. And if you have to go, if the sea ice disappears, we don't have sea ice algae anymore. So the copepods have nothing to eat, nothing to graze. So the polacod has no. The polacod, that fish, here it is, has nothing to feed on, and then the seals have no polacod, and they don't have the ice because they need the ice to come out of the water in order to complete their molt and for giving birth and mate, and they need that for a couple of months, at least a year, 2 or 3 months. And so if they don't have that ice, then their whole reproduction cycle is going to be interrupted. Yes, a ring seal could potentially go on land, of course, but then they become a very easy prey for polar bears. So how long is it going to that last? That's not going to be, that's not going to sustain longer either for the ring seal or the polar bear.
Okay, great. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there. So I'll hand it back to you, Annie, for some closing comments.
Okay, well, Kendall, thank you so much for helping us accomplish this webinar. We really appreciate that. And Rinie,
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so great to work with you. And of course, thank you to everyone who's watching. We couldn't do our jobs or this presentation today without you. Final words, Rinie?
Thanks for having me.
You bet. You're welcome.
You're done?
And my thanks as well. Yeah, be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll get that replay out to you soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Thanks, Annie and Rinie. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.